Italy. It's hard to imagine it without Rome. But before Rome came along, there were the Etruscans, a mysterious and ancient civilization. Centered in the region of Etruria, modern Tuscany, western Umbria, and northern Lazio, they established vibrant city-states with a rich culture, profoundly influencing the Roman kingdom and republic that succeeded them. Classical authors recognize the Etruscans as early rulers and cultural benefactors of Rome. Indeed, even Livy and many others record that several of Rome's early kings were Etruscan by origin. So why not come with me and trace the Etruscans' development from their mysterious origins to the formation of their city-states, through their political and economic zenith, and to their military struggles and eventual assimilation. Along the way, we'll take a look at their governance and legal institutions, artistic achievements, their trade networks, linguistic legacy, and even a little bit about their religious rites. Well, we'll see by the end that all of these facets of Etruscan civilization certainly left a permanent mark on Roman culture. All assertions, of course, are supported by primary sources and reputable historical analysis. We're not going to go too far into speculation, and if we do, which sometimes we must due to the mysterious nature of the Etruscans, we'll be doing strictly within the confines of academia. So, just briefly, the chronology of Etruscan civilization spans roughly from the 9th to 1st centuries BC, and that's what we'll be talking about. During the Villanovan period, that's around 900 to 750, a proto-Etruscan culture emerged from the Bronze Age Urnfield tradition in Italy. In the subsequent Orientalizing and Archaic periods, 750 to 500, Etruscan city-states took shape and prospered through trade and cultural exchange with Greeks and Phoenicians, along the way developing advanced arts, governance, and religion. Then we'll discuss the classical period, the 5th and 4th centuries, which saw the Etruscans confronted by growing external pressures, the Greek colonies, the Gallic incursions, and of course the early expansion of Rome, leading to territorial contraction and political decline. By the Hellenistic period, 3rd to 1st centuries BC, Etruscan cities were gradually absorbed by the Roman Republic. In fact, Etruria was effectively under Roman rule by the 3rd century. But still, the legacy of the Etruscans endured, even as their language faded, the final inscriptions appearing in the 1st century AD. Many Etruscan religious practices, artistic styles, architectural innovations, and legal customs lived on just within the confines of Roman society. And so, to appreciate Rome and their indebtedness to the Etruscans, well, it's probably best that we understand who the Etruscans were and how they organized their world. Well, let me welcome you to the channel first. Of course, it's obvious by now what we will be discussing, and discussing it for quite some time, I'm sure. Thank you to all who have supported on the Patreon and the merch store, also the YouTube memberships. You have my thanks. And thank you in advance for clicking the subscribe button, which is conveniently located right next to the like button. Now, with that being said, let's get nice and relaxed, and we can begin. Well, let's begin in the early times, that aforementioned period between 900 and 750, that is the Villanovan period. The origin of the Etruscans has long been a topic of fascination and debate, and I dare say will continue to be so for quite some time. The ancient writers preserved divergent theories. Herodotus, writing in the 5th century BC, recorded a legend that the Etruscans, whom the Greeks, by the way, called Tyrrhenians, were migrants from Lydia in Asia Minor. Faced with famine, a group of Lydians led by Prince Tyrsenos sailed west and, quote, no longer called themselves Lydians, but Tyrrhenians, finally settling in Italy. By contrast, the Roman historian Dionysius of Halicarnassus, writing in the 1st century BC, so some 400 years later, argued the Etruscans were autochthonous, the indigenous people distinct from any known group, with a unique language and culture, a view more consistent with modern archaeology. Well, today we have a scholarly consensus based on archaeological continuity, and that is that the Etruscan civilization developed locally from the Proto-Villanovan Iron Age culture, the age preceding them, about 1100 to 900 BC in Tuscany and northern Lazio. Evidence from cemeteries and material culture shows a gradual evolution rather than an influx of foreign populations. For example, the earliest Etruscan sites around 900 BC already exhibit distinctive burial customs. We're talking about very richly furnished cremation urns placed in well-organized necropolises that grew out of preceding local traditions, of course. And so by the early Villanovan period, these communities began to accrue wealth from metalworking and agriculture. Etruria was blessed with an abundant resources of metal, especially iron from the island of Elba, and copper, tin, and other metals in its hills. Archaeometallurgical evidence, that's a big word, suggests that even in this formative era, the inhabitants were exploiting metal deposits and engaging in trade. Villanovan trade networks linked Etruscan proto-cities with distant regions. Archaeologists in our modern times have found early Etruscan Bronze Age goods as far afield as Sardinia, the Balkans, and even the Aegean, and that certainly provides a lot of evidence that their trade networks were long. After all, they had all the good metals, and that goes a long way. The market is broad. Notably, bronze fibulae, or clasps of Italian make, have been discovered in Greece and the Near East, indicating contacts well before 800 BC. Exchanges like this accelerated cultural development and social stratification in Etruria. By the 8th century BC, Greek seafarers, especially Euboeans from the colony of Pithecusae on Ischia, and Phoenician merchants were regularly visiting the Etruscan ports. They came for metal ores, and they offered exotic goods in return. It was a fair deal, good for everyone involved. Now this catalyzed an orientalizing period from 750 to 625 in Etruscan art and society, a time when Eastern Mediterranean motifs and luxuries, that is, engraved ostrich eggs, carved ivories, things like this, began to flood Etruria. Excavations of Etruscan tombs from the 7th century, etc. at Ve, Care, and Tarquiania, reveal imported Greek pottery, Egyptian scarabs, and Levantine jewelry, alongside locally produced items, attesting to Etruria's integration into broad Mediterranean trade networks. During this early period, the Etruscans had begun developing their writing system, which would become one of the most significant contributions to Rome. Sometime around 750 BC or thereabouts, they adopted a version of the West Greek alphabet, brought to them by Greek colonists in Italy, and with a few little tweaks, a change here and there, adapted it to their own language. Now the Etruscan alphabet, written typically right to left by the way, is very close to the archaic Greek alphabet of Euboea, including letters like F, diagamma, and X, which the Latin later borrowed. Indeed, Latin alphabet is directly derived from the Etruscan script, by the way. Romans learned writing from the Etruscans in the 7th century BC, and countless Etruscan inscriptions, over 13,000 actually, survive on tombs, poetry, and artifacts. We have so many of them. Well, although the Etruscan language is non-Indo-European, and our understanding of it is a little bit lacking, scholars have identified many loan words that passed from Etruscan into Latin. For instance, the Latin word persona, that is person or persona indeed in the modern vernacular, originally meaning a theatrical mask, derives from the Etruscan versu, mask. Other Latin terms with probable Etruscan roots include sateles, attendant or satellite, perhaps from the Etruscan satnal, and even populus, people, which intriguingly may relate to the Etruscan god Fufluns, though the connection is debated. The very name Roma appears in Etruscan inscriptions as Ruma, with the cognate form Ruma X meaning Roman, suggesting that the city's name was known in the Etruscan tongue. Such linguistic vestiges show the close interplay between early Rome and the older Etruscan neighbors. Well, now moving on to when things really start to get in motion. And so, by the 8th and 7th centuries BC, the Etruscans were forming urbanized city-states, independent, fortified, each ruling over surrounding territories. It was really starting to look like something by this point. Not just a bunch of villages and huts, but walled fortresses. That's when you know you have a civilization propping up. The Greek poet Hesiod, around 700 BC, already described the Tyrsenians, the Etruscans, as a people of central Italy, and later Greek sources depict them as an organized and often piratical, seafaring people. The heartland of Etruria contained a dozen or more major cities, which later Roman tradition referred to as the League of the 12. Though the exact membership is uncertain, the League likely included such cities such as Tarquiania, Veii, Caestra, Cleves in Perugia, and many more. These cities shared a common language and a religion, and met annually at a holy sanctuary, the Fanum Voltumane, near Volsini, for religious festivals and mutual council. So according to Livy, at this annual council, a leader, perhaps a ceremonial Zilath Mekrasnal, or chief of the Etruscan people, could be chosen to represent the League. However, this Etruscan League was not a centralized nation-state, one must remember. It was more of a loose confederation along religious and economic lines, akin to the Greek city leagues, and individual cities retained their sovereignty. Unity was often fleeting. Etruscan cities might ally for mutual defense or projects, but there was no permanent capital or unified military command. Now, in political terms, the Etruscan city-state, Mac or civitas, was governed by first kings and later magistrates. Early on, prior to the 6th century, each city was ruled by a king, possibly called Lucumo in Etruscan. These kings were also high priests, reflecting the theocratic nature of Etruscan rule. The government was seen as a central authority, with the power of life and death over citizens. A power symbolized by the image of the Gorgon's head, and apotropaic emblem often appearing in Etruscan art and regalia. That's pretty threatening, to have a Gorgon's head as your symbol. Yeah, that's pretty good. I mean, the Roman eagle is good too, but the Gorgon's head is also pretty cool. While in Etruscan tomb paintings and decoration, the frightful visage of the Gorgon signified sovereign authority and served to ward off evil. But over time, Etruscan governance evolved. By the 6th century, many Etruscan cities transitioned from monarchy to an oligarchic republic, just as Rome basically did around 509 BC. The same process. Archaeological and inscriptional evidence suggests that councils of aristocrats and elected magistrates took on governing roles in some cities by the late Archaic period. For example, inscriptions from Etruria lists titles of magistrates like Zilath, Parnik, Camthi, and Mauru, etc., indicating a complex republican administration. Although we don't know the precise functions of each office, but we know they were there doing something at least. Notably, Etruscan society was dominated by powerful aristocratic families. These noble lineages accumulated wealth via trade, and they held great sway because of it. Money is power. Much like in Rome, they were kind of similar to the Roman patrician class gentes. In fact, the Roman concept of gens or clan and the importance of familial lineage may be modeled after the entrenched Etruscan aristocratic system. Families who built large tombs and emphasized dynastic continuity. Etruscan law and custom were deeply intertwined with religion and social ritual, and there is evidence that many early Roman legal and political institutions had Etruscan roots, prototypes or at least influences. Now, for instance, the fasces, a bundle of rods with an axe, carried by attendants, the lictors, as a symbol of magistrates' power to scourge and execute, was borrowed directly from Etruscan royal insignia. Etruscan tomb art has even yielded an actual bronze set of fasces, rods, and axe from Vetulonia, confirming the symbol's Etruscan usage. The Romans attributed to Etruscan kings the introduction of other state symbols and rituals. We're talking the golden crown, the ivory throne, or sella curulis, the purple-bordered robe, that being the toga praetexta, the scepter, and the triumph ceremony, all said to have their roots from Etruscan tradition. It's been described, for example, as the first Roman triumph, now that is a victory parade if you're not familiar, was modeled on Etruscan processional customs. Even Roman law in its earliest form was heavy sacral and ritualistic, a feature that scholars link to Etruscan influence. The 12 Tables, Rome's earliest law code around 450 BC, came about in a context where legal procedure involved formalized rituals and symbolic acts, such as the ritual of mancipatio, or the chanting of precise verbal formulae. This emphasis on ritual in law is reminiscent of the Etruscan approach, where religious sanction underlay political power. While our knowledge of specific Etruscan laws is scant, Roman writers acknowledged an indebtedness to the jurisprudence of the Etruscan tradition. For instance, the concept of the pomerium, a sacred boundary of which the city magistrates could not cross with arms, and that was an Etruscan practice that was adopted by Romulus himself. Roman augural law, the requirement to take auspices that divine approval before official acts, likewise stems from Etruscan doctrines that governments must heed the will of the gods. Economically and culturally, the 7th and 6th centuries BC were the heyday of Etruscan power, really the golden age. Etruscan cities grew wealthy from the Mediterranean trade, which was booming. They exported metal ingots, finished bronze wares, wine, and pottery, and imported luxury goods to enjoy. Also, you'll find fine ceramics absolutely everywhere in their tombs, all from this time. Greek pottery in particular was prized as a status symbol in Etruria, so much that Greek workshops in Corinth and Athens created special vase designs catering to the Etruscan tastes. The customer is always right in matters of taste, of course, as that is the full quote. Vast quantities of Attic red figure and black figure vases have been unearthed in Etruscan tombs, indicating that vast trade network with Greek markets. Meanwhile, the Etruscans developed their own distinctive black glossy pottery known as bucchero, which became an export good in its own right. Bucchero tablework, with its elegant shapes and lustrous finish, has been found at sites in southern France, Spain, North Africa, and the Near East, evidence of Etruscan merchants or the far-flung exchange of gifts. Etruscan metalwork, from fine jewelry to large bronze sculptures, was also renowned. Indeed, Etruscan bronze cauldrons, armor, and votive figurines have been discovered in the Celtic tombs north of the Alps and at Pan-Hellenic sanctuaries in Greece, that is, Olympia and Delphi, where they were dedicated as prestigious offerings, only the best for the deities. But one hallmark of this era was the formation of Etruscan colonies and spheres of influence beyond the confines of Etruria. Etruscan adventurers and traders established themselves in the Po Valley to the north, founding or perhaps taking over cities like Felsina, later Bononia, and later, in our modern vernacular, Bologna, and as far south as Campania. By 600 BC, the Etruscan League existed in Campania, centered on the city of Capua, indicating direct Etruscan rule in that region. They also held sway in Latium, at least before Rome sorted that out. Many of these expansions were likely driven by the search for metals, arable land, and trade routes, as well as strategic alliances, for example, with Carthaginians against the Greeks. And now we arrive to the Archaic period, during this time between 6 and 500 BC, where Etruscan culture produced extraordinary art and architecture, the majority of it with religious or ceremonial purpose. Etruscan art is especially known for its vibrant wall paintings, intricate metalworking, and terracotta sculpture. Unlike the Greeks, the Etruscans did not often carve large statues in stone, despite the fact that they had access to quality marble. If you ask me, it's a bit of a waste. They should have used it. Oh well. But instead, they excelled in terracotta sculpture, creating life-size statues that adorned temples and tombs, and also in bronze casting. Now we do have a famous example of this, as the splendid terracotta statue of Apollo at Veii, that is around 500 BC, which once stood on the roof of the Portonaccio temple. This stylew, now in the National Etruscan Museum, Rome, shows Apollo in dynamic motion, reflecting a blend of Etruscan vitality and Greek stylistic influence. While the Apollo of Veii, a painted terracotta statue about 5'10" tall, originally stood on the temple roof, it exemplifies Etruscan archaic art, with a stylized smile and almond eyes similar to the Greek Kouros figures, yet it was rendered in terracotta rather than stone. Etruscan tomb paintings provide a vivid window into their life and beliefs too. In sites like Tarquinia, and Chiusi, aristocratic families built elaborate tombs carved into rock, whose walls they decorated with frescoes of banquets, dances, sports, and mythological scenes. One striking example is the Tomb of the Leopards around 480 BC at Tarquinia, named for the leopards, of course, painted guarding a banquet scene on the back wall of the tomb. The frescoes portray reclining diners, men with dark skin, women with light skin in the artistic convention, servants, musicians playing flutes and lyres, and dancers, all celebrating what appears to be a funerary banquet in honor of the deceased. The joyful, almost exuberant depiction of the afterlife feast reflects Etruscan belief that death was a transition to another form of existence where one could enjoy earthly pleasures as long as the proper rites were observed. Many tomb paintings also have religious or mystical elements. For instance, tombs at Tarquinia show scenes of augury, or a figure called the Fersu, masked man in a ritual game that might be an early form of gladiatorial combat performed at funerals. These funeral games, which the Etruscans held to honor the dead, are believed to be a direct precursor of the Roman gladiatorial games, later staged in the Great Colosseum. A Tarquinian tomb painting found in the 6th century, the Tomb of the Augurs it is called, actually depicts two men engaged in wrestling or boxing as part of a funeral ceremony. Romans themselves acknowledged that their munera, gladiatorial shows, began as Etruscan funeral rites adopted by the early Romans. And the design of Etruscan temples and cities also had lasting influence. Etruscan temples, as described by the Roman architect Vitruvius and evidenced by excavations, differed from Greek temples in several ways. They were typically built on a high podium, with a deep front porch, and had a mostly wooden superstructure with terracotta decorations, and were arranged with a clear frontal orientation, that is, steps only at the front. The great temple of Jupiter Optimus Maximus on Rome's Capitoline Hill, erected in the late 6th century BC during Etruscan rule, was built in the typical Etruscan style, featuring a triple cellar plan for the Capitoline triad of Jupiter, Juno, Minerva, a deep columned porch, a rich terracotta statuary, possibly crafted by an Etruscan artisan from Veii. Archaeology confirms that the earliest monumental buildings in Rome, that is, about the 7th to 6th centuries BC, certainly were executed by Etruscan builders, or, if not, heavily influenced by their know-how. Either way, Etruscans were masters of engineering and architecture, at least by the standards of their day. They understood arch construction and vaulting well before the Romans did. Well, the Etruscan city of Volti's Gate and the stone art of Perugia are from pre-Roman times. They also excelled at hydraulic engineering. The famous Cloaca Maxima, Rome's central sewer canal, was, according to Roman tradition, constructed in the 6th century BC under the Etruscan king Tarquinius Priscus. This massive drain, which began the process of reclaiming the swampy Forum Valley, is a testament to the Etruscan engineering skill. They also dug drainage tunnels called cuniculi to irrigate fields and drain water. Many such tunnels survive in the countryside of Tuscany. To this day, really, you can still see them. They also pioneered the use of the Tuscan column, a strong, unfluted column derived from the Doric order, which the Romans later adopted especially for military architecture. But religious rites, that was the core of Etruscan private and public life. The Etruscans were polytheistic, worshipping a vast pantheon that included both indigenous gods and those adopted from Greek mythology. They believed that the will of the gods manifested continually in the natural world, and that through proper divination one could interpret divine signs. The Etrusca Disciplina was the corpus of sacred knowledge, essentially Etruscan religious law, which codified the methods of divination and the interpretation of omens. Chief among these practices was the haruspicy, examining the entrails, especially the liver, by the way, that was particularly important. Now, the Etruscans developed an elaborate system for liver divination, dividing the organ into sections representing different deities and portents. A remarkable artifact illustrating this is the liver of Piacenza, a bronze model liver from the 2nd century BC, covered in inscriptions found in northern Italy. It was likely a teaching tool for trainee diviners. Each region on the model liver is labeled with the name of a deity, showing how an Etruscan priest would map a real sheep's liver to the divine cosmos. The Romans were so impressed by Etruscan divination that they retained the Etruscan haruspices as a specialist priest in the imperial era. In fact, even after Etruria was politically subdued, Rome maintained a state board of these diviners, often of Etruscan descent or in training, to consult during times of prodigies and crises. Additionally, Etruscan augury, interpreting the flights of birds and other natural omens, was integrated into Roman state religion. Rome's highest priests, augurs, and pontiffs adopted many Etruscan ritual conventions. So, all up, the Etruscan religious influence on Rome was very profound, I'm sure you'll agree. Several major Roman deities and cults were directly influenced by Etruscan equivalents. For example, the Etruscan goddess Uni was equivalent to Juno, Tinia to Jupiter, and Menva to Minerva. These formed the principal triad in both Etruscan and early Roman worship. The practice of portraying gods in anthropomorphic form with statues in temples was introduced to Rome by Etruscans. Early Romans may not have had cult statues until the Etruscans came around and got their artisans to help them create a few. Etruscan mythological heroes, many borrowed from the Greeks, also filtered to Rome. For instance, the hero Hercule, from the Greek Heracles, was venerated by the Etruscans and passed into the Roman cult as Hercules, with attributes shaped by Etruscan interpretation. The Roman religious calendar itself, typically attributed to Rome's second king, Numa, well, that too appears to have been influenced by the Etruscan models of reconciling lunar and solar time, likely developed in the late 6th century BC when Etruscan influence in Rome was at its peak. And so 500 BC, Etruscan power was at its apogee. But the tides were turning. The late 6th and 5th centuries brought new military challenges, and from multiple fronts. The Etruscans were renowned in earlier times as formidable warriors and sailors, sure. Greek authors often mention tyranny and pirates dominating the western seas. Etruscan warfare typically involved heavily armored infantry fighting in a phalanx, an approach likely adopted from the Greek hoplite model. Hey, if it works, why not do it? As well as cavalry, drawn from the aristocracy. In war, the Etruscans sought not only territorial gain, but status and loot. Captured enemies might be ransomed for wealth or even ritually sacrificed in honor of fallen Etruscan nobles. But as neighbors grew in strength, the Etruscans found themselves increasingly on the defensive. The southern outposts in Campania came under pressure from the expanding Greek city-states of Magna Graecia and indigenous Italic tribes, while the northern holdings in the Po Valley were threatened by the migrating Gallic tribes. One pivotal conflict was with the Greek colonists in Italy. In 540 BC, a fleet of Phocian Greeks from Corsica encountered a joint Etruscan-Carthaginian fleet in the Battle of Alalia. That was fought off the coast of Corsica. Though the Greeks claimed a costly victory, the battle effectively broke Phocian naval power, leaving the Etruscans and the Carthaginians dominant in the Tyrrhenian Sea. Soon after, Etruscan influence in the south began to wane. In 524 BC, the Etruscans, perhaps led by a southern Etruscan city of Clusium, suffered a defeat at Cumae in Campania. A generation later, in 474, Hiero of Syracuse won a decisive naval victory over the Etruscans at the Battle of Cumae. This battle crippled the maritime power of the Etruscans and ended their control over Campania. The Etruscan city of Capua fell to the Samnites, another Italic people very soon after. Greek and Roman sources typically portray this as a turning point. The rich Etruscan coastal cities would no longer shield their trade or colonies from Greek retribution. Etruria's loss of access to the southern markets dealt a blow to its economy. Things were certainly going to get worse from here. Similarly, the Etruscans faced invasions in the north. Around the end of the 5th century BC, that is around 400 BC, bands of Gallic Celts crossed the Alps into the Po Valley, sacking the Etruscan settlement of Melpum and threatening many others. Etruscan control over the fertile Po plain, that is the Padanian Etruria region, rapidly disintegrated under Gallic pressure. By the early 4th century, the Etruscans had lost cities like Felsina, which the Gauls renamed Bononia. It's now the city of Bologna. So I wonder, is it an Italian city, or is it a Gallic city? Now that's a matter of debate. But either way, this Gallic push south culminated in the infamous raid of Rome by the Senones in 390 BC. Now, it's important, though Rome was a Latin city and not Etruscan, it certainly shows the shifting power dynamic that also affected Etruria. The net effect was that Etruria was now hemmed in, no longer expanding, but fighting for survival on multiple fronts. The greatest rising threat, however, I'm sure you know, was Rome itself. After the expulsion of Rome's last king, Tarquinius Superbus, an Etruscan by the way, in 509 BC, the Roman Republic grew in military strength and began encroaching on Etruscan territory. Early Roman historians recount wars with the Etruscan city of Veii, Rome's neighbor, just 16 kilometers to the north. That's a little too close for comfort, isn't it? The conflict between the two cities spanned decades, highlighted by the siege of Veii from 405 to 396, which finally ended in Veii's capture by Rome. According to Livy, the Romans under the generalship of Camillus tunneled into Veii after a long siege and destroyed the city in 396. This was a watershed. Rome doubled its territory and sent shockwaves through Etruria. One by one, the southern Etruscan cities faced Roman aggression. Tarquinia, Caere, Volci, Volsini, and others engaged in intermittent wars with Rome during the 4th century. Notably, a coalition of Etruscan cities mustered against Rome in 310, but they were defeated in 310 at the Battle of Lake Vadimo. Better luck next time, kids. And that was a battle that Roman annals celebrate as really breaking the Etruscan resistance. Further Roman victories in 308 and the subsequent decades reduced Etruria to a subordinate status. By the early 3rd century, Rome had effectively dominated all of Etruria south of the Apennines. It is important to stress, too, that Etruscan military power did not collapse overnight. Some cities showed resilience. For example, Volsini remained influential and had to be decisively crushed only in 264, when the Romans brutally sacked it. The final act of Etruscan autonomy, that's for sure, going down in flames. Yet, internal strife and class conflict may have weakened some Etruscan cities from within, as hinted by Roman stories of civil discord in Volsini before its fall. After the Roman victory in the Samnite Wars, where some Etruscans allied with the Samnites and Gauls against Rome, only to be defeated in 295 at Sentinum, Etruria's fate was effectively sealed. The once proud Etruscan League cities were gradually Romanized, forced to cede land, sign treaties, and ultimately, by 90 BC, accept Roman citizenship in the aftermath of the Social War. By 27 BC, with the establishment of the Roman Empire, Etruria was formally merged into the Roman system. Despite military subjugation, Etruscan contributions to warfare and armaments were not forgotten. The Romans adopted and adapted Etruscan military technology over time. Etruscan helmets, that is, that distinctive bronze helmet with the rounded apex and cheek flaps, were precursors to some Roman helmet designs. The concept of the military triumph, as we've mentioned, had Etruscan roots in victory parades. Roman military camps and colonies may have drawn on Etruscan surveying techniques. The Etruscans were certainly skilled in laying out cities on orthogonal plains. The excavated Etruscan town of Marzabotto is laid on a grid aligned to cardinal directions, which prefigures the rigid grid of Roman colonial towns. Tactically, while the Romans ultimately shifted to manipular legions, early Republican Rome's army was essentially a hoplite phalanx, influenced by Etruscan and Greek methods. Indeed, Rome's very military terminology shows traces of Etruscan language. The Latin word miles, soldier, might derive from an Etruscan word or concept, and military itself, via Latin militaris, is possibly linked to that. The tradition of disciplinary devotio, sacrificing oneself in battle for the gods, may also reflect Etruscan spiritual influence on how war was ritualized. Roman generals like Decius Mus, dedicating themselves and the enemy to the gods in battle, as parallels with the heavy religious context Etruscans gave to warfare, etc., prisoners sacrificed on tombs of leaders. As Etruria came under Roman rule in the final centuries BC, the Etruscans became Roman citizens and were gradually assimilated. Like it or not, the Latin supplanted the Etruscan language in daily life, though Etruscan persisted in religious context for some time, and over generations Etruscan identity blended into the broader Roman-Italian identity. However, many Etruscan cultural elements were not lost. Instead, they were just absorbed into the Roman apparatus, becoming an integral part of what we recognize today as Roman civilization. The Romans themselves, often pragmatically, preserved what they found useful or hallowed in Etruscan tradition. We've already noted several areas of Etruscan influence, so here we summarize the most significant Etruscan contributions to Rome. The first being urban planning and architecture. Now, the basic template of Roman cities owed much to their Etruscan precedents. According to Roman law, Romulus founded Rome following the Etruscan ritual. He plowed a sacred boundary around the Palatine Hill and established the Pomerium, the inviolate city boundary, following the Etruscan practice. Archaeology suggests that early Roman urban infrastructure, drainage systems, defensive walls, forum layout, was initiated under Etruscan supervision. The use of an arch in construction, which became the hallmark of Roman engineering, think of the aqueducts and the Colosseum, was pioneered in Italy by the Etruscans. Roman temples in the Republican period were built in the Tuscan style, with high podia and axial plans, directly emulating Etruscan temples like those of Veii and Tarquinia. The Capitoline Temple in Rome, its massive scale and triple cellar design, set a pattern for the later Roman temple architecture, all thanks to an Etruscan blueprint. Even the later Roman preference for building cities on hilltops with strong fortifications echoed the Etruscan habit of choosing elevated sites and encircling them with thick walls. Moreover, the Romans maintained the Etruscan practice of dividing the city with a north and south street and an east and west street aligned to the auspices, a reflection of the Etruscan belief in sacred urban order. And then we have governance, political symbols, and law. Many of the early Roman political institutions, they show their fair share of Etruscan influence too. The Roman Senate, which might have been inspired by the councils of nobles that ruled Etruscan cities after the monarchy. The regalia of Roman magistrates were explicitly Etruscan in origin. The lictors with their fasces, the curule chair, the purple-bordered toga, praetexia, worn by consuls and later by boys and magistrates, and the golden scepter and crown used by generals celebrating a triumph, all adapted from Etruscan royal ceremony. Roman legal and religious concepts also betray Etruscan roots. The Latin word ritus, ritual, could well describe the Etruscan approach to law and governance, which was to sanctify the secular authority through ritual. The Roman concept of auctoritas, of the Senate, a kind of legitimization of authority, has been linked to the Etruscan reliance on divine sanction for political decisions. Furthermore, some of the Roman magistracy titles may etymologically stem from the Etruscan. For example, the title rex, or king, was certainly not Etruscan, that being lucumo, that was used for a ruler in their tongue, but camillus, an assistant to priest. One moment. An assistant priest, rather, excuse me, and possibly praetor, if it related to Etruscan prefect roles, show cross-cultural links. When the Romans instituted the position of dictator, an extraordinary magistrate with absolute power for a limited time, don't think of it too much in our modern term, they granted him 24 lictors with fasces, that is, double the normal consul's allotment, a detail that might also hark back to Etruscan notions of kingly power, as Etruscan kings perhaps had 12 lictors, a number later standard for Roman kings, at least according to Livy. In law, the persistence of Etruscan religious law, the Etrusca disciplina, meant that Romans, even as they codified secular laws, continued to consult the inherited Etruscan rules for interpreting prodigies, consecrating temples, and dividing territory. Of course, we can't go past the religion and ceremony. Roman religion was so suffused with Etruscan elements that one ancient sentiment was that the Etruscan discipline encompassed the whole of Etruscan knowledge, implying Roman sacred law was largely inherited from Etruria. The College of Augurs and the College of Haruspices in Rome perpetuated Etruscan divination. Roman generals on campaign and emperors in Rome would often call on diviners to interpret unusual occurrences. Think of monstrous births and lightning strikes, this sort of thing, a tradition directly descendant from the Etruscans. The ritual of the triumph, the highest military honor, that had Etruscan trappings too. The triumphant general wore a gold-embroidered toga, called a toga picta, and a laurel crown, and his face was painted red, just as the Etruscan kings may have done. This was mainly done to represent Jupiter, by the way. Some sources suggest that even the word triumph might derive from an Etruscan shout of exultation, or a name of an Etruscan procession. The gladiatorial games, as mentioned, were introduced in 264 BC at a funeral in Rome specifically as a revival of an old Etruscan custom of blood offerings to honor the dead. In everyday life, Romans continued to observe many superstitions and customs of Etruscan origin. For example, the practice of making dies fat et nefas, that is, auspicious and inauspicious days on the calendar, from Etruscan priestly law. Well, that was also one of the gods permitted public business. So, arts and culture now. As Romans absorbed Etruscan territory, they were also absorbing the Etruscan craftsmen, performers, and artisans. It came as a package deal. Etruscan art forms influenced early Roman art, especially in the centuries where Rome had not yet developed its own monumental art tradition. The earliest Roman bronze statues. Oh, I don't know. Think of the Capitoline wolf, that one with Romulus and Remus. If genuinely ancient, that is, there's a bit of debate about that, were likely Etruscan works or heavily influenced by the Etruscan style. Etruscan music and entertainment, that also left its mark. The Romans enjoyed their styled performances, and tradition says that the first stage performers or dancers in Rome were imported from Etruria to appease the gods during a plague in 364 BC. Whether or not that stopped the plague is a bit of a mystery. The Roman love of spectacle, chariot racing, and athletic contests at religious festivals had Etruscan parallels or origins. The Ludi Romani games held in the Circus Maximus traced back to games introduced by Rome's Etruscan kings, featuring chariot races and boxing matches in Etruscan fashion. And Roman funerary customs, like the lavish tombs of the elite in the late Republic and Empire, think of the monumental mausoleums, things like that, might be seen as an extension of the Etruscan aristocratic emphasis on elaborate tombs and ancestor veneration. And then we have language. Although Latin was fundamentally different from Etruscan, it incorporated numerous loanwords, especially for things associated with Etruscan culture, with noted examples like balteos for belt, sateles and persona, and possibly even arena, connected by some to an Etruscan term for a sandy place. The names of two of the three original Roman tribes, the Ramnes and Luceres, appear to be Etruscan words. Perhaps Rasna, or related to Rusna, meaning Etruscan people, and Lucumo, meaning chief, respectively. This hints that the early Roman population had an Etruscan component, or at least Etruscan nomenclature, in its organization. The Roman onomastics, many family names, gentes, were of Etruscan origin. For example, the Semproni, Pomponi, Claudi, etc. These were because these families had Etruscan ancestors, or they adopted the names from Etruscans upon integration. Even in the imperial period, elite Romans took pride in tracing lineage to Etruscan heroes. Maecenas, the famous minister of Augustus, was of Etruscan nobility from Arretium, and that's just to name one. And so, by the time of the early empire, the Etruscans as a distinct people had largely vanished. But don't worry, their imprint on civilization was undeniable. I'm sure you agree. I hope I've convinced you. The Roman poet Virgil in the Aeneid acknowledges the Etruscans. He calls them Lydians, by the way, nodding to Herodotus's tale mentioned earlier, as allies of Trojan Aeneas and contributors to the Roman ancestral melting pot. Romans continued to visit Etruscan oracles and venerate Etruscan gods. For instance, Vertumnus, the Roman god of seasons and change, was originally an Etruscan deity, Voltumna. So in summary, nearly every facet of Roman culture, political institution, religious doctrine, engineering, art, military ritual, and even fashion carried an Etruscan fingerprint. The Roman author Cicero paid tribute to Etruscan expertise in divination in his treatise, and Livy and Dionysius documented Rome's indebtedness to the Etruscans. Modern historians concur that without the Etruscans, Rome would have been a very different place, if there had been Rome at all. The Etruscans functioned as a conduit through which the elements of Greek and Eastern Mediterranean worlds flowed into Rome, and they were also innovators in their own right, giving the Romans truly original contributions, from the grandeur of the Capitoline Temple to the dignified ceremony of the Senate, all the way to the layout of the Roman Forum to the gladiatorial games in the arena. They passed on a torch of civilization to Rome, and later Rome passed on that torch to Western culture. It's a legacy that ensures the Etruscans, though often overshadowed by the Romans in popular memory, are rightly recognized by scholars as a foundational predecessor to Rome. And that is it for today. I hope you enjoyed it. I'm going to thank my top tier supporters both on YouTube and Patreon. Very good people. Dark, Kimberly, Christine, Sally, Ember, Susan, Cameron, Legitmus, Gary, Charlene, Linda Reese, Katiana, Nicholas, Ulford, Neil, Alexander, Charles, Christine, Dr. Neuro Nerd, Erin, Jaden, Jim, Jeffrey, Jessica, Madeline, Melissa, Orthodox Review, Scott, Stark Factory, Shell, Wendy, Josie, Sarah, Ryan, Thor, Cameron, Stephen, Kevin, HMSHH, Crystal, and Talvery. Thank you so much. Well, everyone, that is it for tonight. I'd like to thank you once again for joining me. I hope you've learned all you needed to know about the Etruscans. Perhaps I'll do a little bit more about them. Who knows? The future is a big place, and you'll see me again. When I see you again is entirely up to you. Good night, everyone. Lots of love to you all, as always.